Welcome to this Gardner photography video. In this video we'll be taking a look at the Sigma 150-500 f5-6.3 DG OS HSM. That's quite a long name, and from that we can tell that the DG tells us that this will work on both full frame and crop sensor cameras. The OS tells us that it's got optical stabilization, or image stabilization in other words, and the HSM stands for hypersonic motor, which will help this lens focus quietly and quickly. So with a focal length of 500mm, this lens provides a great zoom range, which you would normally fork out for an L lens. To get a 500mm lens, this is one of the only lenses which offers it. I think Tamron do one as well. But also it goes right down to 150, and there's also a 50-500, which is slightly more expensive. And to be in this price range as well, this sells for about £800. The recommended retail price is $999, which is very reasonable for what you're getting. But as a sacrifice, this is f6.3 at 500mm, and particularly on my lens at f6.3 it's not particularly sharp, and I have to stop it down to about f9 or f10 to get a nice sharp picture. And at that point you are sacrificing a lot of light, which means that you have to use higher ISO or slower shutter speeds, which does hinder your photography. Particularly at 500mm you want to keep the shutter speed high. The lowest you want to go really is 1/500th of a second. The general rule is you don't want to shoot any slower than 1 over the focal length that you're shooting at. So say you're shooting at 50mm, you wouldn't want to shoot at a shutter speed slower than 1/50th of a second. And seeing as this has a 500mm focal length, you don't want any less than 1/500th of a second. I'm using this on my 550D, which has a 1.6 crop factor. So this is effectively something like 200 to 800, which is a lot of range, and it's great for long distance sports on big pitches such as cricket, football and rugby. That's where I use it most. It's also good for wildlife, although I don't do an awful lot of wildlife photography. I think it's quite good for portraits, because especially if you have the subject at the closest focusing distance, which is 220 centimeters or 2.2 meters, then you can get really nice bokeh on this lens. The background just goes really nice and creamy, so it's not exactly a macro lens, but you can get some nice close-ups with sharp detail, which is good. Just a few more specifications on this lens. It has 21 elements in 15 groups, so that's quite a lot of glass, which makes this a heavy lens. It's 1.78 kilograms. It has 9 aperture blades, which helps with the round bokeh. Obviously the fewer blades, the more angular the bokeh looks, which I don't think is as pleasing, so 9's pretty good. It's got a minimum aperture of f22, which is sufficient, I think. I don't think you really need any more than f22 for the situations that you're going to be using this lens in. The maximum magnification is 1 to 5.2, which isn't particularly great. Macro is 1 to 1. The filter size is 86mm, which is large. It's pretty much the largest filter you can get before you have to start having rear end filters, which you get in the more expensive lenses. So what comes with this lens? Well, in the box you get the lens, obviously. It comes with the tripod collar, which is very useful because being such a heavy lens and a long lens, if you mounted it onto your camera and then mounted your camera to the tripod, there is quite a high risk of breaking the mount, so it would just snap off here. which can be expensive to get fixed. So you just fix it using the tripod collar, and that balances it perfectly. It also doubles up as a handle for carrying it, because this lens is heavy. It's got nice moulded grip, and it's quite a lot longer than some of the bigger lenses. I know the L lenses have quite diddy little feet on the tripod collars, which aren't so great for holding it by. So you get the tripod collar, you also get a strap, which just straps in here, and that makes it a lot easier to carry. You get the lens hood, which is big. It's just over a third of the length of the lens itself, and that just stops any sort of light rays bouncing off the lens and giving funny reflections, which isn't really desirable. And then on the inside that has a sort of ribbed effect. On the outside it's just plastic. It's sort of a matte plastic which picks up fingerprints and grease really easily, so this is quite dirty. You can see all the fingerprints on there. The actual body itself is made from some sort of rubberized metal, I think. So it's strong, but it's also heavy. Again, that's a matte finish, which gets greasy and it gets scratched quite easily. And when it gets scratched, it goes all shiny, which makes it quite noticeable. Then you've got these switches, which are plastic, but are quite solid and stay where you put them. And then for the tripod collar, this is just sort of rubberized, which makes it quiet. So if you're obviously doing some wildlife photography, then if you bang it on something, it's not going to make too much of a noise. But again, that gets scuffed easily. And then there's obviously the metal mount. No rubber gaskets. This isn't weather sealed, which is a shame because it would make it a lot better for what it's. I mean, it's supposed to be for sport and wildlife. In both those environments, you're gonna encounter rain, so it'd be nice if they did make it weatherproof, but that would bump the price up by quite a lot, I would expect. For the filter thread, I've got a filter on here. Is it focused? Yeah, that's good. So there you can see the filter thread, and that is metal, which is good because it means it won't get mucked up if you thread the filter in wrongly. Oops, like I just tried to do there. Like so. The lens hood is very good. It's sort of a pinch cap with a pinch in the middle, which is great for when you've got the lens hood on. You can just reach in and pinch. If you don't have the lens hood on, then it's got a pinch on the outside, just like a normal lens cap, which I think is just a nice little feature which makes using this lens a little bit easier. There's the ribbing that I was talking about inside. Makes some quite interesting noises. And that just slots on like so. It's just a twist and it stays in place. The actual size of this lens, the dimensions are, the diameter is 94.7mm and the length is 252mm. That's obviously fully retracted, and it gets quite a lot larger as you zoom in. One of the main complaints people seem to have about this lens is the zoom and focus rings. In most lenses you have the zoom at the back and focus towards the front, whereas in this lens you have the focus here and the zoom down here. Now this might seem silly to start with because you want the zoom accessible and you're going to have your hand here, but there's a thing called long lens techniques which you use to stop vibrations and wobbles when shooting with long focal length lenses. And one of the important things you want to do is keep your hand down towards the end of the lens to prevent shake. And by having the zoom ring down here, that forces you to keep your hand down this end of the lens, which makes it nice and stable. Also, when you're holding it like this, then the focus ring is actually quite handy, and it's just operated by one finger there. And the focus ring has a nice long track, so this would probably be good for video if you wanted to do a focus pull. It's also quite smooth, whereas the zoom ring, especially when it was brand new, the zoom ring is very stiff. I've owned this now for a year and it has loosened up a bit, and it does suffer from lens creep, but that's expected because this is a very heavy lens with lots of glass in it. But it's just a bit stiff and sort of clunky. It doesn't rotate smoothly, which is a shame, but it doesn't get in the way of using the lens, so it's not too bad. The rings have this rubber sort of ribbed texture, which is good for gripping them, and the zoom ring is nice and big. It's down there, so you've got plenty to hold on to there, and it just extends like so. So that's the extension. And then the focus ring is smaller, so it works nicely. Let's talk about the switches. So we have AF and manual focus switch. We have OS off, OS 1 and OS 2. Let me get this right. One of them prevents vibrations in the horizontal plane and one in the vertical. I can't quite remember which one's which though. I don't really use OS because it's quite noisy. It sort of clunks every time you half press the shutter button, and when you're shooting at high shutter speeds you don't really need it. Then we also have a handy little feature which is the lock switch. It only works when the lens is fully zoomed in as it is now, and you just hit it into lock, and now when you pick it up you can't zoom, which is great for when you've got it in your bag or you're carrying it and you don't want it hitting stuff or extending. Unfortunately it only works at 150, so if you zoom it in then try and lock it, it just won't lock, which would have been a nice feature to see, but again that would have probably added to the cost. But it's definitely a nice feature to have. This lens also has a focus window, which is great for shooting at night when you can't necessarily see the focus through the viewfinder. Say you're, I don't know, getting a silhouette of a tree against some stars or something, and you can't see clearly enough to tell whether it's focus through the viewfinder, and it's too dark for the autofocus to work. You can gauge roughly how far away the tree is, and the actual window has measurements on it, and then you can just set it to the right measurement and take a couple of test shots and just move it around a little bit, but you know roughly where it is, which is nice and handy. I forgot to mention that this lens also comes with a nice padded lens bag, so you can see that it's got some nice shaped foam at the top and bottom, which prevents the lens from moving around inside the bag, and it's got nice thick walls, and it's got sort of a textured outside, so that is good for just carrying the lens. It only has room for the lens though, not the lens in a body or lens in some other lenses, so I don't tend to use that too much. So let's take a look at some footage. Here is the lens with the strap on and without it, and without the tripod collar. That just about rounds up my review of the Sigma 150 to 500. Thank you for watching. Hope you found it useful. So just in conclusion, this lens is perfect if you have just bought an SLR and you're looking for a bit more range than your kit lens, quite a bit more range. You want to get into sort of specific areas of photography such as wildlife or sports, but you don't quite have the money to buy, 100, 400